Okay. Hello, good evening. Pleased to have you here. I'm not quite sure where the ship is in terms of its location right now. I know we're going to Suda Bay, but we're probably at some point traveling, below Greece at some point. So much of what is going to be happening in here, is happening north. It was happening north of us, about 2,500 years ago. And some of it also happened considerably. Matter of fact, very important events occurred in Sicily, where we just were. So this ties in kind of where the ship has been and where the ship is going. Okay, so let's look at the history of the Peloponnesian War. And I find this to be quite interesting in a sense that, for what it's worth, I think that this comes from a, whoops, I'm sorry, I don't want that. Okay, let's go back for a second. Okay, I find this particular portrait interesting because I don't understand what weapons they use. The chap all the way at the end has got his shield up, but he has no weapon in his hand. The guy on the ground has no weapon in his hand. The person right in the middle looks like it's a fly swatter or something. So I'm not quite sure, whether this is really trying to illustrate war or not. But this came off pottery. This came off like kind of a jar, Okay, so let's look at Thucydides at the Peloponnesian War, mostly through the eyes of the chap that's in the middle. That's Thucydides. He lived in Greece. Matter of fact, he was also a Greek general or admiral, depending upon what you want to call it, because he led a fleet, but he was called a general. But he lost a battle in 424. And if you lost a battle with the Greeks, the results were not good. So he was exiled for 20 years. So he had a lot of time on his hands, so to speak, to write the history of this particular war. And to me, the amazing thing about Thucydides is how much insider information he had. I still don't really understand, like those of you are probably familiar with the books by Bob Woodward, where he interviews all the people in an administration and, gives you all the dirt, so to speak, that kind of thing. I would argue that he was the Bob Woodward of his day, but how he got all that information and how he was on top of things, I don't know. I think it's really quite interesting. But the book ends 7 years, his writing ends 7 years before the end of the war. And it stops in mid-sentence, not clear why. So he never finished it. As I said, he had 7 years to go. We don't really know what happened. And then the book, essentially, or what we know, was continued by these two chaps here, particularly by Xenophon and also by Diodorus. And Xenophon picks up almost exactly where Thucydides ends. So that's kind of a more clean flow of things. But as I said, Thucydides was the Bob Woodward of his day. And he is considered to be one of the great classical historians. So we need to give him credit. Okay, so here's our order of march for today. We're going to talk about the principles of realism. We're going to do that so we can then relate it at the end to today's setting. We're going to set the scene in terms of what was going on back in Greece at that particular time. And I need to point out, even though it's the history of the Peloponnesian War, it's not the history of the Peloponnesian War, it's the history of the Peloponnesian Wars. Matter of fact, it's a very confusing timeline, if I could put it this way, because you had war, you had peace, and sometimes the major opponents kind of allied with each other during the periods of peace, and they went back to war again. So it's a start-stop campaign. And the thing about it is, it's very confusing. I first read this book when I was a college freshman. I first read this book. And the thing that Thucydides does is, think of a puzzle that has 1,000 little pieces. He gives you all the 1,000 little pieces, but he leaves it to you to get the big picture, so to speak, out of these 1,000 little pieces. So it's actually not just simply a war between Athens and Sparta, who were the two main proponents here, but it's a war between Athens and Sparta, their allies, their colonies and so forth, and going back and forth. So it's really hard to keep track of the players, even with a scorecard. And there'll be one particular interesting player, Alcibiades, which we'll talk about, that it's even hard to figure out what he was doing most of the time without a scorecard. Okay, so let's start, though, in the principles of realism. And basically, this is a theory of international relations, and it basically says, hey, trust no one. It's dangerous to be out there. You're living in a system of anarchy. In other words, when you live in a system of anarchy where there is no government above you, then it's basically kind of like every man for himself if there's no government above you. So you have to take care of your own security needs and your own other needs. And it's basically, though, trust no one, because everybody is out to get you. Everybody is out to get you. Nixon understood this, or he that was his view, I think, true. You are responsible for your own security. Really don't count on somebody else to help you, because they might help you, but then again, they might not. And be especially aware of power differentials. And what that says is if you have greater power, you're probably going to be in good shape than the person that has lesser power. So there was that particular focus again. So as I said, David and Goliath, which is what's being illustrated here, is a nice story, but kind of don't bet on it. Maybe it worked for David, and maybe he had special help from God or something, but don't bet on it, and don't think that you're going to be the David in today's, in the world of that time. So it's more dog eat dog than it is kumbaya. So it's a tough world, and you have to learn to live with it. Okay, and if you go back, though, this idea of it's a tough world and you have to learn to live with it and you have to take care of your own is seen both across space and across time. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is, except for Venice, look at all of these cities. And actually, if you have a chance to go to Malta, or if you have a chance to go down the Dalmatian coast, all the little cities that are on there, look at them. They all have walls. In other words, they were basically saying, trust no one. In other words, the only one that doesn't, of the major cities that really didn't have a wall, actually Sparta didn't have it, but they had a citadel, is, look at Venice over here. Venice has no walls. Venice is completely open, because its wall was what? Its wall was the lagoon. Its wall was the lagoon provided a moat. And the Venetians knew how to get through the lagoon the best way and so forth, but their enemies didn't. So whereas if I was in Kotor or Dubrovnik or Malta, I needed to build a wall because my enemies could get up there too. The Venetians were lucky in the sense that they didn't have to worry about that. And even in terms of, if you've been to Paris, you know that as you're going around the Pied de Frique around Paris, there's la porte cliché, la porte this, la porte, this door, that door, that door. That goes back to the era when Paris had a wall all the way around itself. And that's a principle of realism. You need to protect yourself. And it's also universal across time, at least to be, so here is Troy over here, in terms of the old, the Trojan Wars, and there's the sea over there where the Greeks came into, where that sea is, in the background, but you had to get inside that, and that's what the Trojan horse was about, to get them inside the wall. That's what they wanted to do. With the Peloponnesian Wars, what you had was, and we're going to be stopping at the port of Piraeus, as you can see here, but there was what is referred to as the Long Wall. So here's the city of Athens, port of Piraeus is some distance away, but they built a wall all the way around that, to keep the Spartans out. And here's today's version, of building a wall, and that's Israel's Iron Dome over here. So your wall, in this case, is encompassing you, if I can put it this way. So if there are missiles that are coming in, you would hopefully be able to shoot them down. And the same thing with the Spider air defense system, over here. So you can see we're building, in this case, an electronic wall, if I can put it this way, that can keep track of things. So the realist would say because that's reality. Okay, let's look at just some of these ideas very quickly. Thucydides, for instance, said that men were driven by honor, greed, and fear. Fear because they had to be taking care of themselves, and that kind of devolves all the way through. Distrust and fear being built into the human system, built into the human body. So in our brain, we have what is referred to as the amygdala, and the amygdala is that thing which causes fear. It causes you to kind of, really start to worry about things. And people have tried to also explain it in other ways. And when I say evolution or original sin, depending upon what your perspective is what does evolution do to us? Or what has been happening there? Evolution says that basically you evolve, in order to be better adapting to the new environment. But in order to better adapt to the new environment, your fundamental principle is self-preservation. So self-preservation means that you preserve yourself over all other things. You do what you need to do to keep yourself alive, to keep yourself going, and to keep actually your ancestors, your descendants going too. And some people describe that as original sin, because this idea of I need to do what I need to do to preserve myself, and that might mean I need to kill you, or I need to rob from you, or whatever, but I need to do it in order to live. And it's a function of evolution. Now, you have some chaps there. The person all the way at the top left is Machiavelli. And basically Machiavelli says, the same kind of thing. And he was the one that particularly kind of has been associated with the idea that you need to do what you need to do in order to survive. Morality is important, and we like morality, but morality, is not going to save you if somebody, wants to take away what you've got. So Machiavelli kind of introduces us to this idea of the fundamental principle is your self-preservation. I could have put another picture up here, Richelieu, for instance, and Richelieu is the one that really came up with that policy, so to speak, at the national level, because saying, interest of state, national interest, that has to dominate over all things. And also, back in the old days, people would go to war, and they weren't concerned about the morality of going to war. So that when Bismarck, for instance, was chancellor, he didn't spend time thinking about, should I go to war or not go to war because it's just or unjust or that kind of thing. He says, hey, I need to go to war because I need to do this, whatever it is. Morality didn't enter into the discussion. And so these other people would be saying to Bismarck, right on. Here we have in the center picture Milton, and Milton actually commented a lot on Thucydides, and Milton, says essentially the same thing. I mean, not Milton, Hobbes, I'm sorry. The center gentleman is Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, who wrote the Leviathan. And Hobbes again says the same kind of thing in the sense that if there is no government above you, if there's nobody to if there's no police above you, if there's no authority above you, you're on your own. And he says, unless you're careful, your life is going to be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And in order to prevent your life from being nasty, brutish, and short, you have to be, if I can put it this way, nasty and brutish yourself in order to be able to survive. E.H. Carr, which is the third person with kind of the round glasses, he was especially he wrote a book, interestingly enough. After World War I, there was this period of what you want to call idealism. No war, never again, we're not doing that, we're going to the League of Nations, that kind of thing. E.H. Carr wrote a book that says that's totally unrealistic. It's moving away from the principles of realism. And when the war broke out, again in 1939, he had just finished his book and he entitled it The 20 Years Crisis. In other words, since the end of World War I, we've basically kind of been building up to World War II. And again, it almost says the natural course of events. And then we have over here Hans Morgenthau that I cut my teeth on when I was in graduate school. And basically Morgenthau says that war is inevitable between great powers that share the same geographic space. So he basically says if you share the same geographic space, that's why think of marriage, for instance. Think of good marriage. A good marriage really works because you're sharing the same geographic space. But if you're a Morgenthau, there's never a good marriage, if I can put it this way. If you're sharing the same geographic space, somebody's got to dominate. Somebody's got to be on top of the situation. Okay, and the biggest threat is proximity. And by proximity, I mean that if we look over here, and hopefully, here we are. Okay, and I can't make it work. But if you have whoa, let's go back. If we have a situation one, green versus red, if green has that much power over red, you don't have to worry about it. In other words, probably war will not break out. Green doesn't have to go to war against red because he already dominates, and red is not going to go to war against green because it knows it's going to get pounded into the ground like a tent peg. If you're in situation 2, however, where red is going up, red is increasing its power, and green, which was at the top, is probably kind of coming down. That situation of proximity, that situation where they may be becoming equal or coming close to equal, is a situation where war, it's a recipe for war. So, our friend Thucydides said, the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired on Lacedaemon. Lacedaemon is that area where Sparta was in. Sparta was in the center of that. The alarm which this inspired made war inevitable. And again, that's a principle of realism, that war is inevitable. You don't have to believe it, but that's what the thinking was. Okay, so let's set the scene, though, in terms of what's going on at this time. Okay, because this is going to be a Greek civil war. This is what it's going to be. And the Peloponnesus is the area where both Athens and Sparta are in. This part which has Greece and it comes down Thessaly, Euboea, and so forth. That's the Peloponnesus, over here. So the war in that particular area. So you had these two powers, about 150 miles apart. Athens was a naval power. It was basically, through Pericles, a democracy. It was rich from trade, rich from silver, and from bounty. It got bounty from the lesser states of which it lorded. It enjoyed luxury in the arts. It honored intellectuals, because we're talking about Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, these people, and the various writers of Greek tragedies and so forth. And it formed what's called the Delian League after a war with the Persians in 478. So what's happening here, and we'll talk about it in just a second, is it's a war not only, as I said, between Athens and Sparta, but it's kind of like the U.S. versus the Soviet Union was also a war between the NATO and the Warsaw Pact. It was between those groups of states, together. So Sparta is a land power. It was an oligarchy, a military oligarchy. And I've got the word slaves in quotation because the people that they had doing most of the dirty work were essentially more like serfs. In other words, they weren't, a slave to me is somebody that can be bought and sold, but you didn't want to buy and sell them. You just wanted to have them living out there. And one of the things, though, that the Spartans were concerned about is there were a lot more helots than there were, let's say, true native Spartans. So they were always worried about insurrection. And so that was kind of, let's say, a weak spot. But they scorned luxury and the arts. They honored martial quality. So if you were a young man, in the right class, so to speak, you left your home early, and you basically went to a military school and a military tradition. They were built around, that's what it was. They say that, a country like Pakistan, Pakistan doesn't have an army, but army has a country. Pakistan's army has a country, which is Pakistan. And that's the way it was in Sparta, in a way. The Spartan military owned the country, if I can put it this way, and it wasn't the other way around. And in 550, they formed their own Peloponnesian League. So you've got these two NATO versus Warsaw Pact situations occurring. Okay, we have to kind of set the scene, a little bit. Okay, so there's the Peloponnesus and so forth right there, in the corner, all the way at the end, inside the blue circle. But that kind of orangish color and so forth, that's the Persian thread. That was the 800-pound gorilla, of the day at the time, which the Greeks were very much worried about. Athens, though, was behind. Athens was the one that inspired a war against. They didn't inspire the war, but they were part of the war, and they won a war against the Persians in 490. And for what it's worth, and let's see again if I can make this work. But it's in 490 that, people run a marathon, 26.2 miles. Okay, I was told to stand here because of where the camera is, and my clicker doesn't work in a sense of pointing out. But if you look at the map on the left-hand side, you look at the green up at the top, that little green bubble up at the top, follow that. That's 26.2 miles from where the battle took place into Athens. And this man ran 26.2 miles, said we won, and then collapsed and died. But he did his job, if I can put it this way. 479, the Athens and the Athenians and the Spartans jointly defeat the Persians, because that was always, again, the big country that was in the background. Sparta pulls back out of this, and the Athenians form the Delian League. And I'm just giving you this background so that you can kind of get a sense that while the war with Persia is pulling back, Sparta pulls back, but Athens does not. Athens is really feeling, its oats, if I could put it this way. Okay, so the Persian threat, though, was checked at this time. So the question was, who dominates Greece? That 800-pound gorilla is still there, but that 800-pound gorilla has been checked. So now it's kind of like you look around and you say, okay, well, which one of us is going to be the top dog out here? So the Delian League, which is the Athenians, checks Persia in 466. And then after that, then Athens and Sparta see each other as the main threat, having basically suppressed this threat from the Persians. Now they look around at each other and say, okay, that's where the main threat is, right now. And Athens was more hawkish and ambitious of the two. The Spartans were more, they were a land power kind of located in the middle of this part of the Peloponnesus. And they weren't, they had no real interest, I don't think, in developing an empire per se. They wanted to be there in the middle. They wanted to kind of almost be left alone, but be ready to smite anybody that comes in and challenges them. That's what their concern was. And here I stand bent forward. That's from a pottery, and that's when the Delian League checked Persia in 466. This is a pottery is supposed to be depicting the Persians, kind of like saying, "Okay, you won, which is kind of neat. So much of what we see today comes from pottery more than anything else, I think. Okay, so let's look at the Peloponnesian Wars. Though it's not just one war, it's a series of wars and the times in between. Okay, and this gets really, really complicated. So what you had, as I said, was hegemons with coalitions. The Athenian hegemon and the Spartan hegemon with its coalition. The Spartans have the Peloponnesian League. The Athenians have the Delian League. And again, look at just the large number of people. I don't know the number of people in the Peloponnesian League, but in the Delian, 205 members. So that's one of the problems of keeping track of this. You're trying to keep track of lots and lots and lots of moving parts. But what was Sparta about in terms of the Peloponnesian League? One was to keep the Helots down. The Spartans were always worried that the Helots were more numerous than they were, and they had to be kept down. And they wanted to keep Argos in check. So, Sparta is down over here, and I wish I could make the arrow work. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so that's Sparta over here. That's Athens over here. But Sparta's immediate threat actually was what's in its own backyard. It's this town of Argos. So they wanted to keep the Helots down, and they wanted to keep the Argos people down. But what you got was a 60-year world war. It goes on and off. And you had two different, as I said, remember the slide I gave you earlier that said that Sparta was a land power, Athens was a sea power. The asymmetries were just too big. There were no knockout blows on this because it was hard for them to kind of meet together. Because one had the navy, the other had the army, and particularly Athens did the right thing under Pericles. Pericles told the people around him in Attica, come inside the walls, and we are essentially impregnable. So every time the Spartans would go up to try to deal with the Athenians, the wall basically stopped them. And the Spartans really had no navy, and not much of a navy to speak about, so they weren't challenging the Athenians on the sea. But in the midst of the 60-year world war, you had periods of peace. And you had peace in quotes, probably, and of Athens-Sparta alliances. So Athens is over here, again. And so Athens is in yellow. So the yellow that you see it's called the Athenian Empire. Athens and all of its allies, all the way around here. The parts in red, Sparta is down over here, or is the Peloponnesian Empire, but you can see they're more the Athenians. I mean, the Spartans are more self-contained, and again, they don't really have any desire. Let's say the Spartans themselves, let's say, okay, what we really need to do is we need to control this. We need to control whatever is going on over here. Spartans said, they had no interest in having, let's say, their color be on the periphery of this. They were just simply happy to be where they were. Okay, so, let's look at this with friends or colonies like these, because I'm just trying to point out all the number of estates and a number of different players. And most of the time, though, Athens and Sparta did not initially go to war against one another. It was their allies dragging them in to war. So my ally was being dragged, my ally is having a fight. Oftentimes, my Spartan ally is having a fight with your Athenian ally. They're fighting each other. And so I need to get into the war to make sure that, my Spartan ally doesn't lose or your Athenian ally doesn't lose. So this is very much like what we saw earlier in the war that was and the war that never was. You had the United States supporting the Israelis, and you had the Soviet Union supporting the Arabs. And again, who was really in charge in some ways? Actually, who was really in charge was the Israelis. So we had the threat of being pulled in. The Russians had the threat of being pulled in. It was the Allies or your smaller states that were drawing you in. And everybody had their own rivalry. So it was easy to have wars occur between the little parts, if I could put it this way. But Sparta had its rivalry with Argos. Athens had a rivalry with just about everybody. They were very sensitive to that. Corinth, which was a Sparta ally, went to war against Corfu, which is an Athenian ally, which brought in the bigger powers again. Thebes, again, which is a Spartan ally, went to war against Potidaea, which is an Athenian ally. So oftentimes it was not the two major players, but it was their states, their sponsoring states, or the states that were sponsored, that were really causing the problem. Okay, let's try to look at this timeline. The first war took place between 461 and 446. Then there was 30 years, roughly was called a 30 years peace, 446 to 431. The second war was 431 to 421. The second peace was 421 to 415. The third war then goes to 404. And it's during that third war period that Thucydides' own manuscript stops. It stops in mid-sentence. So we don't really know what happened to Thucydides. It is believed that actually he lived beyond 404. In other words, it wasn't probably because he died or something, but we don't know why he stopped, writing it. And then there's the aftermath, and we'll talk a bit about that. Okay, so let's look at this first war. And I love that helmet on the side. That Spartan really took it in the head, if you can see. And this over here, of course, you have the Athenians. But there was bad blood between both countries. The long walls, the Spartans told the Athenians several times, don't build the long walls. We consider that to be kind of like an aggressive act. And the Athenians said, no, we're going to build them. So they built the long walls in 461. And so you had then this Helot revolt, which is what Sparta was always in deadly fear of. It led to an Athens-Argos alliance. Remember I said that Argos was that one city-state within the Peloponnesus that was Sparta's main rival. And they formed an alliance which defeated Sparta. All right, I'm going to go through this quickly because it's always more of the same. Corinth draws in Sparta in a dispute with Athens. Corinth draws in Sparta. So again, it wasn't because the Spartans, started it themselves. The Athenians were actually very successful during this early period, but they overreached in Egypt in 451. 454, and by 451, they were ready to call a truce. They were saying, okay, now we need to kind of regroup before we do anything else. And at some point, I wonder if Putin is not going to reach that conclusion that he needs to regroup, if I could put it this way. So Athens now is a great power, though, and she's really feeling her oats. Okay, so this is the first peace, referred to as the 30 years peace, and Athens self-consciously develops an empire. That's what it's out to do. It self-consciously develops this empire. It gets a bounty from each one of them. So each one of the members of their empire or of their alliance have to give Athens bounty. And when the Delian League treasury was moved to Athens, as opposed to being on Delios, Athens basically becomes the de facto true ruler of this particular empire. So the Athenian Empire was Greece minus Sparta and its allies. So they're covering all of the territory, so to speak. Every part of the territory is accounted for by one side or by the other side. Okay, but here's the golden age of Pericles, 461 to 429. He is credited with establishing democracy, in Greece. He is credited with building the building of the Parthenon, and he is credited with honoring intellectuals, with kind of encouraging debate and so forth. And this bottom scene is of the Socratic school, Socrates' school, which occurred during this time. As a matter of fact, let's look at this for a second, and we're going to talk about this. It was the age of Socrates and Alcibiades. You all know who Socrates is, I think. He was immortalized by Plato, and interestingly enough, one of his students, and that's what's being pictured, over here, this one. One of his students, that's Alcibiades, together with Socrates. One of his students was Alcibiades, and it was also felt that probably there was Socrates, it's not clear, but it's clear that Alcibiades may have been a switch hitter. So, it was okay to do it with men, it was okay to do it with women. Socrates might have probably been a homosexual, and so Alcibiades may not have been not only a student, but a lover, if I could put it that way. And what's being pictured in the one next door is, though, here's Socrates over here, trying to get Alcibiades to leave, where he's having a really good time with these women. And you can see Alcibiades, essentially, as I get down here, was a Greek god. By God, I meant, women evidently would go weak in the knees when they saw him, that he was, quite good looking relative to other people around. And so you can see Socrates is trying to get him to leave, essentially the house of prostitution. And you can see the women, particularly that woman there, kind of basically, no, don't do that. So in some ways, if those of you that are familiar with the Navy, Alcibiades was what we call a naval aviator. Naval aviators are dashing and so forth. They think they're God's gift to the world. I happen to be a surface warfare officer, so we each make fun of one another because the naval aviators would basically make fun and say, you guys could never get a date no matter how much you did, whereas the naval aviators would be the ones that would take all the women. And Alcibiades was what I refer to as a naval aviator. But this is in the bottom picture over here, this is Socrates saving Alcibiades' life. And they each saved each other. Socrates saved Alcibiades in 432, and Alcibiades saved Socrates in 424. So it's interesting, there's this symmetry between them. But Alcibiades had really good pedigree. His parents died early, so he was raised by Pericles, the head of Athens. He was educated by Socrates. He was a general by the age of 30. But the problem with Alcibiades was his naked ambition and his arrogance. So Alcibiades had a tendency to really irritate his colleagues. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But he had a tendency to really, really irritate his colleagues. And that would work to his disadvantage later on, and we'll talk about that. Okay, meanwhile, back in Sparta, Sparta in some ways, you think about this military oligarchy, and you think, who would ever want to live there? But in some ways, they weren't keen to expand. They regarded themselves as the defenders of Greece against people like Athens. They treated their allies better than the Greeks, but they treated, interestingly, women far better. So if you want to be a woman, you'd rather be a woman in Sparta, I think, than to be a woman in Athens. Women were free to form their own liaisons. They owned property, which was unheard of, incidentally, for a woman to own property, but they owned property. They were considered to be at legs. So here's a woman charioteer, and how she can kind of handle those 4 horses, I don't know, but to her credit, they wanted everybody to participate in games, including the women. So there was men participating in games and women. Women were honored as childbearers, but they didn't have to take care of the children very long because particularly the males were taken away from them and raised kind of collectively, if I could put it this way, to be soldiers. They had day-to-day societal control, kind of like in my house. So my wife has day-to-day societal control, financial control, whatever control there is, she has it. And for the women, the easy thing is if you were kind of one of these upper-class women, the helots did all the work. So what's not to like? If I were a woman, I would have chosen, I think, probably to live in Sparta, although we tend to think, why not live in a democracy? Well, if I can get everybody to do the work and I'm honored and so forth, let me give that a try. Okay, so let's look at the run-up to war. And again, so many of these wonderful pictures that we get come from pieces of pottery. In this case, this is a bowl. You're looking at the inside of a bowl. But both sides were really drawn in by their allies. Athens didn't start off wanting to go directly with Sparta and vice versa. The Athens supported, this gets complicated, so I'm just going to go through it. Just take my word for it. I'll go this way. The Athens supported basically Corfu against Corinth, which was a Sparta ally. So these two allies go to war with each other, and then the big powers get involved. Sparta supported a revolt against Athens. Thebes, an ally of Athens, attacks Plataea, a Sparta ally. Athens attacks a Sparta ally, Megarian. So finally, after all of this is going on, essentially the Spartan citizens decided, okay, we're having too much of these things kind of going on between allies of each country. So they did say, okay, I think we need to go to war against the Athenians themselves. There's just too much stuff going on. And so the majority of the Peloponnesian League, which is what Sparta was in charge of, decided, okay, we are going to go to war. So here's Thucydides again, just to bring him back. War was inevitable because of the rising power of the Athenians and how they exercised it. The Athenian supremacy grew between the present war and the Persian wars, which we talked about those earlier, through their military and political actions against the barbarians, against their own allies in revolt, and against the Peloponnesians. So he knows where, at least in his mind, where to put the blame. Okay, so let's talk then about the second war, 431 to 421. And here, one of the things that happens, and there was probably a real loss. Pericles, whatever it is you want to say to him, was a very, very wise ruler. But the plague hit Athens between 430 and 428, and Pericles succumbed to the plague. Actually, so did Thucydides, but he did not die. Thucydides recovered. But in the second war, there were no knockout blows. Again, you had this asymmetry of power. If you can look at the map over here, and you can see the red arrow, Sparta kept going every year to attack the city walls of Athens, and it didn't work. It just didn't work. So their land campaigns failed, and Athenian land attempts also failed. So both sides kind of basically, they tried and they never really got very far in terms of any kind of, there were no knockout blows. So you have it against the second peace, and even during that time then between 421 and 414, you have a Sparta-Athens alliance. Argos then becomes a problem again for the Spartans. I'll talk a bit about that. Argos seeks to dominate, but so did Alcibiades. Alcibiades is a real piece of work. And I think you'll see more of this as we go along. But Alcibiades backed an Argos-Athens alliance, which then that alliance backs down after its defeat by Sparta. But here I think we have a change in tenor, to my mind, in terms of the causes of the war. Earlier we talked about the causes of the war being the Spartans being afraid of the Athenians kind of rising up and the Athenians really feeling their oats. Here we get to a situation, though, where a populace, this is Alcibiades, maybe is more controlling the narrative in Athens. It doesn't have so much to do with the fear of Sparta as it has to do with trying to win over the people and advance his own interests. So I think, to my mind at least, the situation changes. So instead we lead into the third war, and Alcibiades led the war party. The peace which we just talked about was the Peace of Nicaea. Alcibiades thought that he should have been negotiating for Athens. He did not. The Spartans chose Nicaea instead. So Alcibiades was very angry, with the Spartans, and he convinces Athens to ally with Argos, and it's only because Sparta defeated Argos, but he was leading the charge, leading the war party. And again, this is not a political statement, but it's rather like George W. Bush, during his administration, kind of leading the charge, and that's what Alcibiades was doing. Alcibiades then encourages, a campaign where we just were in Sicily, a Sicilian campaign, because Sicily was resource rich, and Syracuse, which is in Sicily, was an ally of Corinth, which is an enemy of Athens. Again, who you're allied with and so forth turns out to be critical. But look at this. I think this is a neat quote. This is Alcibiades' oration before the Sicilian expedition. Men do not rest content with parrying the attacks of a superior, but often strike the first blow to prevent the attack from being made. And we cannot fix the exact point at which our empire shall stop. We have reached a position in which we must not be content with retaining, but must scheme to extend it, for if we cease to rule others, we are in danger of being ruled ourselves. Now that as much is realism as you can ever get. Nor can you look at inaction on the same point of view as others unless you are prepared to change your habits and make them like theirs. So it's clear where Alcibiades is, and he is, as I said, starting to control the narrative, partly because of his political ambitions. So here we have the Third War, 414 to 404. Basically, the Third War kind of results, so to speak, from the Athenians trying to take over Sicily, and it turns out to be just a true disaster, for the Athenians. And the Spartans basically helped the people in Syracuse. So Sicily is a disaster for Athens during this time. Her allies and her colonies start to fall off, and Sparta goes back to the 800-pound gorilla, that's in the background all the time. It says, hey, why don't we talk? And Sparta works out a deal that says, I'm willing to assure you of your lands, that kind of thing, but I need help against these pesky Athenians. And as far as the Persians were concerned was, I don't know, okay, we're willing to work with you, as a matter of fact. So here, though, you had the Persian ships, beaching at Syracuse, and they're trying to come off the ships, and it was just a total disaster. And remember, Alcibiades was the one that was originally behind this. So let's look at what's happening to Alcibiades. On the way to Sicily, that's why it gets complicated, he was accused of mutilating religious statues. So he had to withdraw. He had to come back. It seems, most historians seem to think that he did not do that. What it was his enemies, back in Athens, looking for a reason to basically take him down a peg or two. So what does he do? This is the first of several defections. He defects to Sparta. He goes over to the enemy, if you think in terms of Benedict Arnold or that kind of thing. And he encouraged Spartan support for Syracuse, which is in Sicily. He alienates, though, the Spartan had two kings at one time. He alienates the one king by sleeping with his wife. So again, Alcibiades, again, is this, naval aviator, Greek god, women go weak in the knees, and so he gets, and so he alienates the king. So in order to kind of get himself out of a jam, he defects to the Persians. So we have, he was an Athenian, going to Sparta. From Sparta, he defects to the Persians. He was a real piece of work. Now, what he does is, when he's with the Persians, though, because he really wants to go back to Athens, he tells the Athenians that he can guarantee Persian help if they will just accept him, Alcibiades, to come back to Athens, and if the Athenian government is changed from being a democracy to an oligarchy. So he's, he doesn't really care, I think, what kind of government there is. He was really very much self-seeking. And the Athenians agree, and they call him back. So, he comes full circle, with everybody. And as a matter of fact, though, he was a brilliant general. He succeeded in major command. But then again, he alienated too many people, and he was forced out of his major command, and he was forced out to kind of retire. So, as I said, Alcibiades is a real piece of work. But here is Alcibiades' return to Athens. And if you can see here, this is Alcibiades here. And, all the women who are greeting him, all, they're like groupies. Or it's like Alcibiades is a rock star or something, and all of these young women, are there to greet him. So, it's obviously a rendition of the power of Alcibiades when he went back to Athens for the last time. Okay, so what happens, though, in terms of the end game? Sparta goes naval, though, and they had a brilliant commander by the name of Lysander, who was appointed the naval leader. He wipes out the Athenian fleet in 405, and he demolishes the Long Wall. And here, what I want to point out, though, is that so much of the battles between these guys, once, in other words, if you had a battle against navies, and he built a navy, the battle against navies was they were basically land battles on wooden platforms. In other words, so you've got your ship here, and I got my ship here, and we maybe meet in the middle or something, and we collide with each other. But it's basically a land battle on a wooden platform. So actually, Lysander does a good thing. Athens is granted moderate terms, and Sparta takes over its overseas territories. But as for Alcibiades, Alcibiades was murdered, probably at the instigation of Lysander, and he was murdered by the Persians. He just made too many enemies. You know, I mean, nobody was sorry to see him go. But again, I think it's illustrative of how Alcibiades was seen. As you can see, who's defending him? There's this good-looking babe, you know, they're standing right behind him trying to get the enemy to stop. And that's a picture of Alcibiades. So, the aftermath, Athens was returned as a player, but not as a big power. Sparta declined over time, that was defeated in 375. And instead now you have, you know, this is Philip over here, and then this is Alexander of Macedon. In other words, Alexander the Great. They kind of rise up and they take over. Okay, let's go very, very quickly look at this, because what's the contemporary relevance? There's this book by Graham Allison, who's at the Belfer Center at Harvard, Destined for War. Can America and Chinese escape the Thucydides trap? You know, USA in his case is Sparta, PRC is Athens, and basically what he says was, you know, we are destined for war if we fall into the Thucydides trap. So, a chap by the name of Ray Dalio, really a good guy if you have a chance to see his stuff. But, you know, Dalio is pointing out over here, you know, kind of you know, this is the United States in blue, this is China in red. And remember I said when you get to proximity of power, that's when you really start to worry, and that's what Dalio was saying. The other two countries are the Dutch and the Chinese, I mean, you know, the Dutch and the Brits, but the two we're concerned about is the deep red. Now, I don't happen to think myself that this is, okay, let's see what happened, not quite sure. Let's go back here and see, okay. I don't happen to think myself that this is the correct picture that you ought to have. So I've got another set of lectures which are not going to be given here, but who will be the greater power in 2040, and that's how I see it occurring. In other words, I see the United States leveling off, and I see the Chinese leveling off. As a matter of fact, I do not see the Chinese being the greater power. You know, their good days are actually behind them. Their good days are behind them. You know, they've reached, and now they have to start worrying about dropping down themselves. So what are the chances, though, of what I call a kinetic conflict? I mean, a shooting conflict, metal on metal kind of conflict. If one or more of the conditions in column A obtains, and the chances are high. You know, if the U.S. tries to defend a breakaway Taiwan, by peak power, you know, Xi Jinping has said by 2027, I want us to achieve peak, you know, military power. And if there's what we call slouching, how did World War I break out? In many ways, it broke out because all sides were kind of slouching towards war. They weren't so much in control of events as events control them, and that's a possibility. And then just simply bad leadership. Bad leadership can bring you to war. Ask Putin, and you'll understand. So instead, maybe we'll have the factors that are preventing kinetic conflict. One is nuclear weapons, which have been pretty effective in the Cold War. Mutual assured economic destruction. Why you would want to go to war when you are going to economically destroy each other. Unpredictability, so maybe you want to really be careful. Kinetic conflict will destroy what might be gained by other forms of conflict. In other words, actually, in order to win a war these days, you don't have to go to war, if I could put it this way. You can win by other means, particularly economic power and particularly technological power, and also if there's a recognition of long-term interest on both sides. So that, to my mind, is you need to pick, though. I can't tell you, you know, which way it's going to go. I can tell you that whenever big wars break out or something, it's always a surprise. You know, it is always a surprise, and who knows, I wouldn't be surprised that we were surprised here. Okay, so finally, you know, that's it. You know, that was that's where the starting point. So thank you very, very much. Anybody that wants to talk about it again, I'm happy to stay here, you know, or go to the bar, or go to dinner, lunch, breakfast, whiskey, please. Yeah, I'm happy to do any of those things for us to continue. Okay, thank you very much.